On October 8, we woke up to this image and to the following message from President Arai Kalayjian. Dear Artak, during this hardest time of war, unfortunately, all our minds and thoughts are on the battlefield. For that reason, allow me to extend from a distance my condolences to you for the loss of your son, Albert. Albert not only managed to inflict great losses on the enemy, but also to distinguish himself by his dedicated service. His famous photo in a unique way reflects the image symbolizing the strong spirit of the Armenian people in the current Artsakh war. Our hero's son's feat is highly appreciated in Artsakh, and upon my decree, Albert Hovanesyan has been awarded with the Medal of Courage. Albert and his comrades in arms put love for the homeland above everything else. Armenians can be and should be proud of their devoted children, equal to you. Today, I have read your request to donate money in lieu of flowers to the development and strengthening of the motherland. I want to pay my respects to your humanitarian and parental kindness. Our people are invincible because they have children like you and your son. Glory and honor to all those martyred for the homeland. You have bestowed great honor. Bati Vunem. Hello, dear friends of the Armenian Bar Association. My name is Lucy Varpetian. I am the chairwoman of the Armenian Bar Association. We have with us as a guest, Dr. Ani Kalayjian. Dr. Kalayjian is going to speak to us about the trauma that a soldier experiences, his family, and ultimately we as a people and a nation, both in the homeland and in the diaspora. I would encourage you to submit questions through the Q&A or in the chat. Dr. Kalayjian will be presenting a PowerPoint. I will include her bio in the chat just momentarily, but I do want to highlight a few things about Dr. Kalayjian, namely that a great deal of her work over the years has been dedicated to the homeland. She has started the first mental health outreach project for Armenia in 1988 after the earthquake, and has been consistent in volunteering there annually or every other year. First with the earthquake, then with the Artsakh refugees, then with Iraqi Armenians, then the Syrian Armenians. Last year, she established the first suicide prevention lifeline, and the installation was April 2020, but due to COVID, it was canceled. She established the first PSI-CHI Honor Society for Psychology in July 2020. And with that, Dr. Kalayjian, the floor is yours. You are muted, Dr. Kalayjian.
Thank you so much, Lucy. Good evening, everyone. It's a very, very sad time for us and a new beginning in our Armenian community, diaspora, and Armenia. It's time to unite, to uplift one another in a genuine way. It's 44 days of intense feelings of extreme emotions, of joy, of fear, of suspense, of faith, and perseverance. We need to start celebrating our resilience. You see here, in spite of demolition, the music continues. As Yerishe Charen said, "O Armenian people, Our only salvation is in our power of unity. This is a challenge for our unity, but let's transform it united together, uplifting one another. Let's review some of the strengths of the Armenian nation, its resilience, creativity, 99% literacy, and high levels of education, perseverance, family values, first Christian state, and skilled crafters. I come to you prepared. I've been preparing for 30 years, working on several books, 5 books on transforming trauma, working with PTSD, from genocide survivors in Rwanda to generational transmission of genocide of Armenian survivors. A CD helping us transform from war to peace, and working through generational trauma into healing and meaning making. As Lucy mentioned, we've been working since 1988 in Armenia. And here is a photo of our work with the Gyumri children in that freezing weather under tents because all the schools were demolished. And just recent mission to Armenia, working on horizontal violence in Tsapatar, the village near Azeri border. We have worked through wars and disasters in natural made as well as human made. We have done reconciliation groups, not only with Armenian and Turks, with Sikhs and with Sinhala, with the Tamil Tigers, with also worked with the TARC, which is the Turkish Armenian Reconciliation Commission. So what is the psychological impact of war? Let's look at the soldiers first. Close to 1,300 have died, but I don't know, thousands are surviving and carrying high level of post-traumatic stress disorder, or maybe major depression, panic disorder. And they will be carrying a lot of guilt, shame, anger, and isolation. And if these are not addressed immediately, they will suffer from compound psychological trauma. These emotional scars sometimes last for decades if not addressed and healed, as we still work with Vietnam veteran survivors, imagine 7 decades later. If not treated, will be passed on to 14 generations through DNA. And what about our communities? Depression, increased rate of suicide, panic disorders, generalized anxiety disorders, moral injury, addiction, which starts with self-medication, difficulty sleeping, drinking a little bit, and then it becomes a habit, domestic violence, and child abuse. Additional complications in Armenia is that the grandchildren of genocide survivors were fighting with grandchildren of the Ottoman Turkish perpetrators and their friends, relatives. We had history of 75 years of communism, which left deep scars in us, including distrust and horizontal violence. I will talk about horizontal violence later. Let's look at the suffering of those displaced, trying to salvage their documents, their belongings, or just their own selves. How about the Armenian family and the Armenian nation? War and armed conflict impact Armenian individuals and families in all countries, from France to Argentina to Bolivia to Jordan to Lebanon, all around the world in the diaspora, and especially in Armenia. The ability of families to perform their expected functions will be negatively impacted due to this trauma. Family relations may become conflictual, increase interpersonal abuse, distraction, inability to concentrate, and these, of course, insomnia, frequent awakening, and irritability. I am feeling it. People that I speak with are all feeling it here in America. And after ceasefire, that shocking sadness permeated, shockwave of pain and disappointment passed through my body, and I was having crying outbursts uncontrollably. We need to give each other the space to cry and be angry and mourn appropriately. What I mean by appropriately, I mean not to displace and discharge our anger and frustrations on each other, putting one another down, as some of the comments in the social media, turning into violence, belligerence, name calling, cursing, and requesting a revolution. This is really something unacceptable, and we need to wake up and really pull ourselves together. It was interesting, this note on social media. Do you want to know why we're taking to the streets, blocking freeways, sending over as much money as we can to Armenian soldiers? Because this happened to our grandparents and great-grandparents 105 years ago. We grew up absorbing the pain, developing the guilt, committing to our liberation. We will never let it happen to us again. But we cannot carry the guilt and the trauma for centuries. That destroys our nation's morale. That becomes complex trauma. We are dealing with not only individual trauma, national trauma of feeling defeated, but we also are carrying generational trauma, horizontal violence, and collective trauma of COVID as well. The national trauma impacts the entire Armenians in the world. Tragic experiences wounded us and could threaten national identity. We need to pull together with a sense of belonging, or else it will impact our social identity in a tragic way. So we need to triumph from this tragedy, developing national unity and moral reframing, changing the script. We're not victims, we're victors. How many of my American friends said, how can you, less than 3 million Armenian people are withstanding almost 100 million Azeris and Turks together, with Israel helping and others helping as well? They were shocked, and it was shocking. We did give a good fight, but there are circumstances that are beyond our control. So let's look at some of the generational impact of trauma. What happens? Grief, sadness, and anger was actually the same as survivors' responses, because we conducted research with the survivors first in the 80s before they passed away, and then we researched their children and grandchildren. You see, the top 3 was identical. We have carried with us the grief, the sadness, and anger, and we need to actively engage in community healing so we don't engage in horizontal violence. Horizontal violence is like being a crab in the bucket, pulling one another down. Be true Armenian and lift one another up. We have these banners in Armenian in Armenia, and we have it, of course, in 48 other countries that we work in their authentic and native languages. We need to learn this. This horizontal violence concept is research based on minority groups in majority places that are like Ottoman Empire for centuries oppressed, like the African Americans in America that have been oppressed. Actually, this crab in the bucket is what Black African Americans call in the South about their situation, what they call Black and Black, what is it, violence, it's called, Black on Black violence, pulling one another down. What happens is that when we for centuries have been oppressed and oppressed and oppressed, while the frustration is building up and up and up, but there is no way to go up because we are still being oppressed, blocked borders between Azeris and Turks. So what happens is frustration has nowhere to go blow up on top. It blows up horizontally. Who is next to me? My own brother and sister. And mindlessly, I put them down because I am so frustrated and I don't know how to manage my emotions. We need to heal together as a nation. The impact of 44-day war in diaspora was extreme, caused sadness. Now with the ceasefire, even more, inability to concentrate at work, inability to sleep, nightmares, long hours at night, sending emails, signing this petition and that petition, and calling congressmen here and there, bouts of crying, increased blood pressure, sleepless nights, frustrations and irritability, and feelings of helplessness. Yes, these are very normal. And we have a wonderful model at ATOP Meaningful World to help through community healing. The first step is assessing what your feelings are and measuring them from 1 to 10 to elicit the level, the intensity. Then releasing that through writing articles to your newspapers, through talking with your family in a constructive way, releasing that because it's poison, all that frustrations and hurt and betrayal. They become anger and then they hurt us and no one else, hurt us and our family. Then the enemy and the oppressors are set free. They don't care, they don't feel this. And the third step is to empathize with one another. Empathy is a wonderful strength and brings us, unites us in then finding some lessons or some positive steps, positive actions and accountability, how to move forward. And then gathering information. Everybody was, it was chaotic. Everyone was posting something else. Everyone was posting a suggestion, a solution, and it was just out of control. And the next step is really centering ourselves and being in nature and healing ourselves, giving ourselves some time, some loving care, loving kindness, and then trying to exercise, run, jog, release, do yoga, whatever works for you, let it out of your system, because these feelings become then illnesses in your body, it lodges in your cells. Bessel van der Kolk has many research studies says trauma is stamped and stored in our cells if we don't release it, if we don't discharge it. We need to work on collective discharge. So we have created this Managing Your Emotions handout. We have had over 30 years educated Armenians to learn from school, like kindergarten, all the way to orphanages, children's centers, universities. And this is a tool This is our GPS, emotional GPS, giving us directions how to grieve, how to release our frustrations, sadness, our fear and disappointments, and embarrassments and shame. We have weekly support groups every Thursday at noon. You are invited to join us. And if you want, I will send this flyer and the link to Lucy, or you can take a photo of it. Many people are trying to help in this situation. Association for Trauma Outreach Prevention with the AGBU representatives in Armenia. We have collaborated with United Sikhs, which are humanitarian organizations. We have worked with them in 2004 after the tsunami in Sri Lanka. They're a wonderful, reliable, and caring organization that provide physical release and help to those perhaps who are displaced in Yerevan and other parts of Armenia, providing them with physical aid, food, and then we are planning to deploy our humanitarian mission to address the psychological first aid in Armenia. Other recommendations for healing and unity: to really feel free to cry as long as you need with your friends and family and trusted people. The release is very therapeutic. To seek loved ones to honestly share your feelings and receive empathy. Refrain from displacing your anger or frustrations onto others. Write your feelings down, engage in creative writing, poems, short expressions, newspaper articles. The world needs to know. Still not too many people know. As I lecture around and I ask my audience, how many people know about this war? And still almost 80% or 90% of Americans do not know about this war. Don't self-medicate and point the finger onto others. And stop posting angry and hateful messages on social media. It does not help anyone. Empathy is the way to go. When you can change the direction of the wind, then we need to adjust our sails. Adjust your sails. That's the best way to deal with the current situation. Here, I am at the end, almost 2 slides left to my lecture. This is a sculpture in New York City at the Cathedral St. John the Divine. And you see the human silhouette, the large one, and then a small and a smaller and a smaller until the red fetus. You see 7 different generations. A Native American has designed and sculpted this. And his message is, in all your deliberations and actions, be mindful of your impact on the next 7 generations. And through scientific research, through DNA, we recently, as of last year, found out that it in fact passes to 14 generations. And this is a valley in India. One woman, it was a barren, very, very ugly kind of valley. Nothing was growing. One woman every year made it her goal to bring in seeds, and flower bulbs to this valley. She has been dead long ago, but look at the beauty that it transmits to us years later. The beautiful colors like tapestry, like a rainbow, purple, yellow, green, and white. Different shades are coming together to give us this tapestry of beauty. So let's not point the fingers. This is Tashnak, Hunchak, Health Association, Bar Association, and this association. This is the time that we come together to mourn genuinely so we don't carry these traumatic symptoms with us for another 14 generation. Thank you, ladies and gentlemen.
Thank you, Dr. Kalayjian. We're going to stop sharing the screen here if you can. Are you able to stop sharing the screen there? Okay. Excellent, thank you. We have a number of questions already in the chat. But I wanted maybe to kick it off by asking specifically about individuals who are on the battlefield, people who have witnessed their friends, their compatriots. What is that feeling like, that you survive and your friend did not? Because as we saw from that initial war image, and we talked about Albert Hovhannissian, what about all the folks that were around him? What is the type of trauma that they are dealing with at this moment?
It would be severe levels of PTSD with survival guilt, extreme survival guilt. We've seen this with Vietnam veterans and with all kinds of disasters around the world. It's a very, very frequently expressed emotion, and it needs a lot of in-depth therapeutic work. And we have trained people in Armenia in EMDR, which is called eye movement desensitization and reprocessing. And that helps quickly to go through and discharge all that negative emotions, much quicker than the classic talking therapy. Of course, in some cases, medication is necessary, depending if they were, as a result, also disabled or, amputated or injured, etc.
Thank you. The first question I have here sort of dovetails on that. And it's from one of our members here in California who has represented many combat veterans with PTSD and TBI, both active duty and veterans on serious felony cases, including murder, attempted murder, and manslaughter. And he asks, would you agree that family history is a relevant factor to be considered? And in the case of an Armenian combat veterans family members who are descendants of survivors of the genocide?
Of course, most definitely. I have been also involved in a situation as such, and we were able to use the history, family history, and generational trauma to their favor in any court case.
And we talked, I think, a little bit about the survivors of the genocide. I think what I'm sensing and what I'm hearing from some of my friends is that when we've talked about what it is that our grandparents have felt over the years and what we've grown up hearing, I think this is the time where we're finally starting to understand and identify with some of their emotions. And I think every family's experience was maybe slightly different. In my family, for example, my grandfather never spoke about the genocide. We have very few stories about what his experience was. How would you compare that to what is happening now as it relates to individuals and their ability to communicate about the trauma?
This is a common complication of any trauma. People don't want to talk about it. And according to our research about the genocide survivors, 70%, they told us that they were speaking about the trauma of genocide for the first time with us, the researchers. 70, almost some of them 68 to 75 years after the genocide. So that is not a healthy situation. The sooner we can talk about it. See, at the time, they weren't able to talk about it because they were in fear. Ottoman was still everywhere in Syria. They were afraid to be found. They were afraid to be subjected to continuous trauma. So they did not talk about it. That was affecting them more in terms of their healing from the trauma. The research and scientific studies show that the sooner you start engaging and sooner you start releasing, the sooner healing starts and less of generational trauma is found. Very important to emphasize that. We cannot not talk about it anymore. You may not be able to talk about it to your friend, but you may be able to write about it, or you may be able to write a poetry, or you may be able to paint and sublimate your pain through that. But sooner or later, you need to discharge that. It's like a poison that makes you paralyzed.
But we're talking about the Hayastansi man. I mean, talking about being able to express yourself in that way is not the first thing that's going to happen.
Yes.
So do you feel that there are the resources in Armenia to deal with this issue? Are there enough resources? Certainly there's some, but
there's some. Actually, when we started working in 1988 in Armenia, there were almost none. But now I am grateful to say that there are a lot more, but not enough. We do need to organize a lot of diaspora support and professionals to go and work in Armenia. And I know some people are doing that, like, going to Armenia, spending time there and working there. So we need to do that. It's not enough because the EMDR Association in Armenia has about 15 practitioners. We're talking a lot of people. We're talking the soldiers, we're talking about displaced people, and we're talking about national trauma. So there's so many levels, and we need to organize more systematic support to go to Armenia and help.
One of the questions asks, how would we communicate with families who have lost someone during the war? How to let them know that their soldiers did not die in vain?
That's a huge, very important question. And I think one of the ways to strengthen is that ability to be able to fight for 44 days with such a small country with no military strength and doing as much for 44 days. I think that's a big success. I don't know. I have to still process. It's so fresh and so shocking, this ceasefire, that I am still processing as well, how to approach that. But I think one of the ways to say that they did the best they could and they were fighting for a good cause. The cause is never changed just because the outcome is traumatic.
And maybe I jumped over this particular question that sort of dovetailed on the issue of genocide. We have in our membership, really coming throughout different parts of the country, young lawyers who are in their 30s, early 30s, whose families were part of the Baku and the Sumgait pogroms. And one particular person I'm thinking about, he said, we were running out the door as the Azeris were hurling my grandmother out of the balcony. And so they barely made it out. And now that we have this situation that has come up, not by the Turks, but by the Azeris themselves. The question is, oops, I lost the spot in the question.
Well, Lucy,
here it is. The question specifically is, what is the best way of communicating with our family and to encourage each other to get help? Meaning those individuals who were actual victims and escaped the Baku and the Sumgait pogroms.
Well, we have two people in our community as well who had to flee in the 90s, the pogroms, and they are completely, really re-traumatized. Once you have a trauma, if it's not addressed or healed, and another trauma comes on top of it, then you're almost double traumatized. So those people have to be especially handled immediately with therapeutic community healing, individual healing, depending on the level of trauma. Now, not everybody will have the same level of trauma. There's mild, moderate, and severe. So we need to assess their level of trauma and address right away. It's not something that easy to be said and then they're going to feel better. They need to engage in therapeutic process, and what we can do is we can have a special healing sessions, especially for those groups that were re-traumatized. They were traumatized in the pogroms and now they're re-traumatized again. So we can have a special group for them, for their to address their specific needs, because that's a really highly traumatized group.
The next question asks, on an individual level, healing is critical. On a collective level, do you think that nonviolent collective action, the type organized by a group like Armenian Nonviolence, could help us begin healing our generationally inherited collective trauma? And I'm not familiar with the Armenian Nonviolence group. It's capitalized. And perhaps you are, so
No, I'm really pleasantly surprised. I work with Nonviolence International at the United Nations because our organization is affiliated with the UN, and we have had many programs with Nonviolence International. So please let that person have my information. So I would look forward for our collaboration. Nonviolence. Collective healing and nonviolence communication, and is the best, most needed way and strategy for Armenians.
There's a question that asks, can you talk a little more about how stress codes itself genetically? And there's actually, I want to say, quite a few questions about DNA, and you touched upon it a little bit. The other questions are, could you please elaborate on trauma impacts on the DNA? And does generational trauma pass through DNA or through interaction with the following generations? So is it through DNA, or is it just by virtue of being, you know, that communication with your grandparents? So these are, I think, three somewhat related but different questions.
Right. It used to be thought that it's a learned behavior, that it's through the communication with your parents and their emotional outbursts or sadness. For example, my family, there was not much talk in my family until I was 16 and I came to United States. And then I found out about the genocide in a way, because we had the April 24 marches and at the UN, and the protesting in front of the Turkish embassy. Then I found out about the severity of the genocide. But I felt all along as a child something that was wrong, some sadness I would see in their eyes, or I would say, what's wrong, Mom? then they would say, oh, nothing, Archigos kana tasit nair, go and do your homework, and there's nothing wrong. But I knew there was something wrong, but it wasn't really explored. So it used to be thought that it was a learned behavior, that you see your parents getting angry or outbursts or sad and depressed, or they don't talk, they go in isolation, or different symptoms like that. But since last year, there's research showing that it does go through DNA and it passes to 14 generation.
You have a great deal of experience with trauma, and it's not necessarily limited to war trauma. We started by sharing that you were at, well, you were in Armenia in 1988 during the earthquake. Again, my family lost, I lost my cousin, her son, and my aunt, who was in Gyumri, spent about 18 months at the cemetery, morning, noon, and night, summer, winter, spring, and fall. She would literally be at her daughter's gravesite all day long, and she wasn't the only one. There were individuals spread throughout the cemetery who would literally be there all day long. And it wasn't until that my 20-year-old cousin got married and had a child that she started to spend more time at home. How would you equate these types of trauma that we're experiencing? Because obviously no one went through any sort of healing through the earthquake. How would you equate these two types of experiences? And it seems like, you know, we just, as an Armenian nation, we just can't seem to get a break.
Yes, 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 that's true. Yes, we were very shocked working with the earthquake survivors. We found out some of their nightmares were not about the earthquake. They talked about the gendarmes, they talked about the Turks, they talked about deserts. And I was saying, what desert? And these are the children of survivors. They didn't go through the genocide themselves. So in exploring more further, we found out that they're talking about their generational trauma. All the trauma was coming out from the genocide. And in Armenia, there's no distinction between Turkey and Azerbaijan because they keep saying they're Turks. You know, I keep saying, do you mean the Azeris? And they say, yeah, they're Turks. So there was no separation between Azerbaijan and Turkey. They're Turks. That's how the Armenians in Armenia were expressing to me at the time, and even after. So usually scientifically, after natural disasters, there should be no anger. Unlike in human-made disaster like a war, there's definitely anger because there's an enemy. In natural disaster, there's no enemy, it's act of God, right? So there should be no anger. But in Armenia was the first time scientifically that we found extreme anger because of roaring sound and because the climate, the geopolitical climate, there was already tension with Azerbaijan and Nagorno-Karabakh issues. So when they heard the roar of the earthquake, everybody assumed it was Azerbaijan sending bombs. And then they ran in sub-basements instead of running outside. So we found teachers surrounded with 12 children in lower levels. While if they knew it was an earthquake, they would run outside. And there, of course, there was no preparation, no, like in California, you have in schools a practice every month, you know, how to do evacuation, what to do in times of earthquakes, right? There was nothing in Armenia. Right. And we started asking them to start, you know, practicing how to escape, what to do in terms of earthquake, etc. Because the last earthquake had happened over 100 years ago, and there was no transmission. The stories were not told from generation to generation. So there was just no collective consciousness about it. So it came out of nowhere, and it was thought that this was a specific act either by Russians or by Azeris. So that's why we found high levels of anger after the earthquake in Armenia, but usually there will be not as much anger. The other anger was toward Gorbachev, because Gorbachev was in New York at the time, and it took him 2-3 days to go to Moscow and release the forklifters and other things, because it was so crazy at the time. They would not be able to do anything without Gorbachev's signature. So there was double anger towards the government. At the time it was Soviet, towards Soviet Union, Soviet leaders, and then towards Azerbaijan as well. And mind you, when we were trying to encourage people to talk, people were asking us, oh, let's talk outside. I said, why? My room is very comfortable. They said, oh no, the walls have ears. Because they could not—
Distrust of the system.
Yes, they could not trust the system. They could not trust the Soviet system. So they could not talk and release their sorrow inside. They would always ask us to talk while walking.
There's a question that leads to the mistrust, and it says, what's the role of, and this is coming back to the current situation, what's the role of understanding the cause of loss, negligence of leaders, corruption, etc., in the healing process? Meaning proper attribution to blame and guilt to the leaders. What's the role that plays if you're able to properly attribute, at least in your mind, where that is?
Yes, those kinds of acts aggravate our healing process, especially the soldiers' families, then the people in Armenia, because they don't even have trust towards their own people who are supposed to protect them. So that exacerbates their levels of trauma. If they had a mild PTSD, would be severe PTSD.
And then the next question I have is, would you say there needs to be special training to work with the Armenian culture before someone can go volunteer there as a therapist? This is coming from an individual who's a student in a master's program for art therapy, but she's been in the US since she was 12, and she feels like the programs at the schools here don't really prepare her well to work with the Armenian culture. Would you recommend a focus? And then she'd like to know if she can connect with you after the program, yes, if that's okay with you.
Yes, of course. I did find tremendous difficulty with French humanitarian aid workers and art therapists, because there was one situation, let me share, is that there was a drawing that they would say, draw your house before the earthquake, and another one, draw your house after the earthquake. And after the earthquake, the child had something like this hanging from the ceiling of the house. And the Lacan analyst from France, from Paris, they were saying, oh, this is a improvement. They're coming out of their trauma. And I'm looking at them and said, what are you talking about? I said, well, there's chandelier in the house. I said, did you ask the child what that is? And the child said that was a noose to hang himself. So yes, you need to at least have the language and some orientation of the culture. And if you don't, then have somebody with you who would have knowledge of the culture as well as language.
So shifting our focus just for a second to the diaspora, and there are a number of us where we come together. I think we find some level of comfort when we're able to share and converse with each other. This question comes from one of our board members who says, I cannot focus on my work since the start of the war. I cannot focus. I come to work, but all I think about is what's going on in Artsakh. Everything else seems negligible and meaningless. This affected and will inevitably affect my work going forward. I'm not sure what is the right thing to do. Do I have a problem? If yes, what should I do? And if I can, just share this with you. We read on social media that this mother lost her twin boys. She received news of the fact that she had lost her twin boys, and she committed suicide because she had no more children to live for. And when I shared that in an email with our board, this individual told me that he was in the middle of defending a deposition. And he couldn't go on. And he basically just broke down and cried, as I'm about to do, because that story is so difficult to comprehend. So what's going on with the rest of us over here?
Yes. As I mentioned earlier, a lot of us are having bouts of crying, anger, frustrations, sadness, difficulty concentrating. These are mild, very mild levels of trauma, but you need to gauge your own level and be able to address it. If you need a break from to focus on healing and join some group efforts, therapies. You can join our next Thursday at noon. We have support group. You can contact me and we can try to assess the level. I have a questionnaire to assess the level of PTSD. We can do that and we can see how to work together, but at least for 30 days from the time I am counting from 30 days from November 10, but I don't know how you are counting. It is normal for 30 days to have these bouts of cry, inability to concentrate, difficulty sleeping, disinterest in work and mundane events. Those are very, very normal for 30 days from the onset of the event. But if it goes over that, everyone definitely need therapeutic professional assistance.
And we've just got just a handful of minutes. I've got a question that says, have the intergenerational trauma and feelings of victimhood somehow handicapped the diaspora in Armenia? And how do we deal with these feelings in a productive manner?
Right. One of the areas I have been lecturing for the last 30 years with the Armenian community is the horizontal violence is affecting us tremendously. We have not only Tashnak, Hanchak, Ramgavar, within the Ramgavars, within the Tashnaks, they're divided into 2 or 3 churches, 2, 3, or 4. So these divisions are all signs of horizontal violence. They're divisions out of anger, hatred, dividing one another, and then draining the unity of our national identity and national morale. So it's very important that we learn more, and Armenians give opportunity to learn more about how to transform this horizontal violence that is affecting us in every level. It's affecting us. So I call for perhaps weekly meetings. I'm happy to facilitate where we can have 30 people in each group, and then we can have each one express their feelings, and we can empathize and start releasing all the pent up frustrations, disappointments, embarrassment, and so on. And we don't need to carry it. Once you learn from your trauma, then you can use that to step up, like use it as stepping stone instead of carrying it like your jagadakir, they say in Armenian. No, it's not jagadakir. It's a stepping stone, so we can get higher and higher in our moral unity and togetherness, so we can impact our next generations in a healthier manner.
My grandmother would call that Hisusitanjanka.
Yeah.
She would say that that's what we have suffered, Hisusitanjanka.
Yeah, the victim mentality. We don't want to reinforce that.
One of the things we had talked about, at least for those of us in the diaspora, was to get involved in very meaningful ways so that you didn't feel helpless, and that you could actively participate and contribute to the effort. And I think we talked a little bit about how that would, what that would look like. And I think your suggestion was, and please correct me, get involved in whatever your profession is, whatever your community involvement is. If you're near a church, if you're near a community center, and if I could just share very quickly the efforts of the Armenian Bar Association. Since September 28th, we've come together and formed a number of task forces, including smaller groups that have been dealing with media outreach, or a task force that's been dealing with reaching out to humanitarian organizations, soliciting their participation, and actively taking a role in what's going on. We have a number of legal initiative task forces that are reviewing and evaluating legal mechanisms under both international law, US law, and countless other things that range anywhere from sharing human interest stories, firsthand accounts, making sure that legally we preserve artifacts. I think that is the thing that sort of was triggered in the last 2 days. We've had a committee that has been with individuals who are experts in art law, who had assembled almost immediately to deal with such issues. And countless other things. If you're an attorney, you don't have to be a member of the Armenian Bar Association, or if you're a law student, we would really encourage you to contact us at info@armenianbar.org. Also, I think Dr. Kalayjian has offered to be available to you as you're going through this the worst event in our history, recent history. And I think we'd like to conclude, and I really have to say we were quite pleased when Professor Harold Takushian at Fordham University made the introduction to you. And we were able to secure this date long before the recent statement was signed. So we're very appreciative for the opportunity and the time that you've taken to be with us. And thank you everyone for attending and watching. Hopefully you found it useful. The comments on the side certainly indicate that. So thank you again, and have a good evening. Goodbye.
Thank you. Bye-bye.